Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished speakers, panelists, and colleagues, my name is Jeoung, Senior Sustainable Development Expert at the UN Office for Sustainable Development, UNOSD, in Incheon, Republic of Korea. I'd like to welcome and thank you all for joining this first session of the 2021-22 Sustainable Development Transformation Forum. The forum is organized by UNOSD, which is part of the UN DESAD Division for Sustainable Development Goals, in collaboration with our partner, the Asia-Europe Foundation. The general objective of this forum is closely linked to the High-Level Political Forum, or HLPF, which will take place in New York in July 2022. It offers a platform for capacity building, policy dialogue, and knowledge sharing for building back better from the COVID-19 pandemic and advancing the full implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The forum is aiming to achieve a better understanding of successes, challenges, lessons learned, and good practices related to the implementation of the SDGs 4 on quality education, 5 on gender equality, 14 life below water, 15 life on land, and 17 on partnerships for the goal. It will also look at some of the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic is having on these selected SDGs and across all the SDGs. And in a forward-looking perspective to identify potential responses and solutions that can also advance the full implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. In previous years, the Sustainable Development Transformation Forum, or SDTF, as the former participants often refer to it, brought together 100 or so participants from all over the world to share the knowledge, experience over the 3 to 4 days in Incheon City in South Korea. Unfortunately, we could not hold the forum in person due to the COVID-19 pandemic last year. And for the same reason, this year again, the forum is also taking place through a series of 2.5 hours of online sessions over 4 days from the 28th February to the 3rd of March, 2022. We hope to go back to the traditional or normal in-person format of all our capacity building activities, and particularly, for the next edition of the Sustainable Development Transformation Forum as soon as possible. We strongly believe, however, that the topics selected this year, the presentations of the excellent speakers, and the discussions will help fulfill the general objective and specific goals we set for this edition of the forum. In this session, you will hear our distinguished opening speakers and panelists of diverse backgrounds from across the world who are involved in one way or another in building back better from the COVID-19 pandemic and fostering the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. You'll hear today a presentation about advancing the 2030 Agenda through education, vocational training, and capacity building. Building forward effective, accountable, and inclusive governance for quality education. Promise and perils of post-pandemic education. Inclusion as key to build back better higher education system, and pathways of change for education and resilience in Peru and Latin America. Now, without further ado, let's start with the welcome remarks for our distinguished speakers. So we'll hear a video from Mr. Liu Zhenmin, UN Undersecretary General for Economic and Social Affairs.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to welcome you to the 2022 Sustainable Development Transformation Forum, organized by the United Nations Office for Sustainable Development. The forum is being held under the theme Building Back Better from the COVID-19 pandemic and fostering the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. I wish to express my gratitude to the government of the Republic of Korea, particularly the Korean Ministry of Environment. Their generous support over the years has allowed UOSD to fully discharge its mandates. Indeed, UOSD's support to developing countries to implement the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development has been crucial. Ladies and gentlemen, this forum is an opportunity to start discussing the state of the progress on the 5 Sustainable Development Goals that will be in focus at the forthcoming high-level political forum in July, namely Goal 4 on quality education, Goal 5 on gender equality, Goal 14 on life below water, Goal 15 on life on land, and Goal 17 on partnerships for the goals. The social, economic, and the environmental impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on the 2030 Agenda, as well as on these specific SDGs, make the challenges we face greater than ever. Guided by the focus of the 2022 high-level political forum and drawing from the scientific assessments in the 2019 Global Sustainable Development Report, this forum will consider opportunities for SDGs achievement through the lens of governance, capacity building and education, policy and institutional coherence, and individual and collective behaviors. As the world grapples to recover from COVID-19 pandemic, we cannot lose sight of our long-term commitments to building a more sustainable and equitable future. The pandemic has reversed progress towards SDGs and has exacerbated the depths and severity of poverty and inequalities. Yet, we have opportunity to reimagine a better future through our response, a fairer and more equal world. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development remains the best framework for doing that. Ladies and gentlemen, to build back better, the United Nations is working to strengthen multilateralism and build solidarity around sustainable development. For example, the Department of Economic and Social Affairs works to support member states in their efforts to accelerate implementation of the SDGs and the recovery from COVID-19. A few important areas include addressing poverty and inequality to leave no one behind, ensuring sustainable financing, continued improvement of data accessibility and application, and protecting our planet through fostering synergy between SDGs and climate action. I'm delighted that the 4 topics to be discussed during this forum will not only examine the SDGs that will be in focus during the high-level political forum in July, they will also explore concrete solutions that can best support sustainable recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic and accelerate the delivery of the SDGs. I wish you all a successful event. I thank you.
I'd like to thank Mr. Zhenmin, UN Under-Secretary General for Economic and Social Affairs, for his welcome speech. Now we have a video from Her Excellency Han Jeoung, Minister of Environment, Republic of Korea.
반갑습니다. 대한민국 환경부 장관 한정혜입니다. 지속가능 발전 전환 포럼 개최를 진심으로 축하드리고요. 이번 포럼을 준비해 주신 박천규 유엔 지속가능 발전센터 원장님, 류전민 유엔 경제사회국 사무차장님, 토루 모리카와 아시아 유럽재단 사무총장께도 감사의 말씀을 드립니다. 코로나19로부터 보다 나은, 보다 지속가능한 회복을 위해 국제사회는 탄소 중립의 깃발을 높이 들었고 자연 기반 해법의 중요성을 역설했으며 플라스틱 등의 오염으로부터 자유로운 지구를 그려나가고 있습니다. 그리고 이 과정에서 누구에게나 공정한 교육과 성평등 확대를 위해서도 많은 노력을 기울이고 있습니다. 대한민국도 2030 온실가스 감축 목표와 한국형 순환경제 이행계획, 자연기반 해법 추진 전략 등 탄소 중립과 순환경제, 자연을 위해 약속한 것들을 흔들림 없이 이행할 것입니다. 또한 국제사회와 함께 평화로 연대해 지속가능 발전 목표 달성에 기여할 것입니다. 이번 포럼을 통해서 특히 올해 고위급 포럼 주제인 교육과 성평등, 육상 생태계, 해양 생태계에 대한 우수 사례와 지혜를 공유하는 뜻깊은 자리가 되기를 기원합니다. 나아가 이를 토대로 우리 모두가 꿈꾸는 보다 나은 미래에 한 걸음 더 다가갈 수 있기를 기대하겠습니다. 고맙습니다.
Jeoung, you're muted.
Sorry. So thank you very much, Her Excellency Ms. Han Jong-hei, Minister of Environment, for remarks. I'd like to now invite Mr. Chong Kyoo Park, Head of UN of the Office, UNOSD. Chong Kyoo.
Thank you, Jeoung. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, based on the location where you are. Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the United Nations Office for Sustainable Development, I warmly welcome you to the 2021-22 Sustainable Transformation Forum. I would like to extend to you all my sincere appreciation for taking your time and attend this forum. My special thanks go to Mr. Zhenmin, UN Undersecretary General for Economic and Social Affairs, Her Excellency Ms. Han Jong-hei, the Minister of Environment of the Republic of Korea, and His Excellency Ambassador Mr. Morikawa Toru, Executive Director of the Asia Europe Foundation, for joining me in welcoming all of you here today. I would also like to express my most sincere appreciation to the distinguished speakers who make this meeting valuable. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the second time that we are having this forum online, or remind that we are far from free of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's very unfortunate that we have entered a decisive decade under such clouds. We are increasingly cognitive that the pandemic has disrupted much of the hard work done by the international community to fulfill the 2030 agenda. Progress toward each of the sustainable development goals has been slowed down or setback. For instance, in education, over 100 million children and youth fell below the minimum reading proficiency level in 2020 alone. On gender, violence against women and girls has worsened, and child marriage is expected to increase. In the international community, the global flow of foreign direct investment fell by 40% in 2020, which revealed the serious risks were hampering global partnership. What about nature? We note that pandemics like COVID-19 will become more likely in the future if we do not protect all life on our planet. We have had more and more gloomy prospect that biodiversity loss will be continuously happened. We will see the pandemic's serious socio-economic impact on people who depend on land and water for their livelihoods and food security. It is depressing economies, which will likely put more pressure on our natural resources and ecosystem. In other words, implementing the Sustainable Development Roadmap has never looked more challenging. It is a desperate race against time. And yet, as the UN Secretary General, and his Antoninis Guterres reminds us, there are also reasons for hope. Ladies and gentlemen, we are meeting today to seek for ways to make the future brighter. The Sustainable Transformation Forum is organized by our office, the UN OSCE, each year for participants around the world to learn about some of the successes, challenges, good practice, and lessons learned in implementing the 2030 agenda and the global goals at national, regional, and local levels. This year's forum will reflect the theme of the 2020 to 2022 Highly Political Forum, building back better from COVID-19 while advancing the full implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. In addition to the theme and selected goals of the HLPF this July, our dialogue will also be based on the 2019 Global Sustainable Development Report, GSDR, The Future is Now, Science for Achieving Sustainable Development, governance, capacity building, education, policy, institutional coherence, individual and collective behavior. These perspectives and mechanisms will inform the conversations to come. In short, this forum is about understanding how a brighter future is still possible. The goals that we'll look at closely are SDGs 4, 5, 14, 15, and namely quality education, gender equality, level below water, life on land, and partnership protocols. We must ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. But we also have to rebuild 20 years of education gains the pandemic has wiped out. We seek to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. But we also need to stop the pandemic from pushing women out of the labor force and increasing gender inequality. We aim to conserve and sustainably use the oceans, seas, and marine resources. The challenges are enormous. Because of the pandemic and other factors, we are behind on many of these targets. And so we have to work harder to recover and build back. But let's remember that this is also an opportunity. COVID-19 gave us a small glimpse of what is possible. The world saw briefly the effects of less carbon-based economic activities and mobility on air quality. Digital transformation has accelerated. The global race to develop vaccines demonstrated to the world the importance of science, innovation, and public-private partnerships. Educators are breaking with the past to go beyond formal assessment and introduce new ways of learning. This year, 2022 is an important one for a couple of reasons. It's the halfway point to 2030, since the SDGs were set up and climate agreement also adopted in 2015. We also mark the fifth anniversary of the United Nations Conference on Human and Environment, which was held in Stockholm, Sweden in 1972. That was the world's first UN Conference on Sustainable Development. We have come a long, long way from 50 years ago. We understand better the benefits of multilateralism and the role of global solutions to global challenges and interlinkages. And just as COVID-19 is a universal and complex challenge, the 2030 Agenda is also universal, integrated, and indivisible. It is this kind of a systems approach that we need to find effective solutions to meet the goals, including those for education, gender equality, life below water and on land, and global partnership. Once again, I thank you all for joining the forum, and I look forward to the discussion to follow. I hope that the message and findings we will share with the world through the internet communique at the end of the forum will be of service to all who are working for sustainable development today and tomorrow. I also hope that we'll be able to meet one another soon in real life for future editions of this program. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jeoung Park, head of UNOSD, for your welcome remarks. Now I would like to invite His Excellency Ambassador Morikawa Toru, Executive Director of the Asia-Europe Foundation, to give his opening speech, opening remarks.
Excellencies, distinguished participants. In this grave hour, let me start by saying that peace is a precondition for implementing all the Sustainable Development Goals. Peace can only be realized through the pursuit of dialogue. Violence is not the solution. Our thoughts are with the innocent people on the ground whose life was suddenly torn apart. Distinguished participants, I would like to express my deep gratitude to our partner, United Nations Office for Sustainable Development, UNOSD, for organizing this webinar and the continued collaboration with Asia-Europe Foundation since 2013. As the sole permanent institution of the Asia-Europe Meeting (ASEM) process, we enhance the exchanges between Asia and Europe through encouraging dialogue and collaboration. ASEF is actively supporting the implementation of the 2030 Agenda and contributes to High-Level Political Forum (HLPF) work on SDGs implementation. Now, allow me to give a few remarks on the 5 SDGs the 2022 HLPF will hold in-depth reviews on. First, on SDG 4, quality education. Progress in education was already too slow to achieve Goal 4 by 2030 before the pandemic. This is further worsened by the onset of COVID-19, which has affected more than 1.5 billion learners. In July 2020, UNESCO invited higher education stakeholders to put the values of inclusion and equity on their recovery roadmap. ASEF has responded to this call by conducting research, organizing conferences, and capacity building workshops on diversity, equity, and inclusion in Asia and Europe. The outcome of these efforts was crystallized as ARC-8 Outlook Report. This report was analyzing how universities and students can foster inclusion and diversity in the final decade for the Agenda 2030 and pointed out potential risks and opportunities in a post-COVID world. The ARC-8 Outlook Report 2030 was recognized as a valuable contribution to the ASEM education process at the 8th ASEM Education Ministers meeting last December. And the ministers invited senior education officials to use the recommendations of the report to promote inclusion in higher education. The outline of ASEF's unique contribution in this area will be presented later at one of the sessions in this webinar. Second, on SDG 5, gender equality. In the response to the pandemic, women have been playing a central role as frontliners and care providers, among others. Despite that, they suffered disproportionate share of the economic repercussions through the job insecurity. It is important to acknowledge and tackle the fact that women's rights and priorities are often not explicitly addressed in response and recovery measures. And this is due to the chronic underrepresentation of women in leadership positions in all levels, both in private and public sectors. Third, on SDG 14, life below water. The pandemic has also led to an increased demand for single-use products, from disposable masks to takeaway boxes, undermining the global efforts in tackling such wastes before the pandemic. Even before the pandemic, the world was producing over 200 million tons of plastic waste annually. Recent research shows that more than 8 million tons of additional pandemic-associated plastic waste have been generated globally, with more than 25,000 tons of that entering the global ocean. In ASEP's research published last year, we found that businesses, especially SMEs, have a crucial role in taking forward innovations to reduce single-use plastic. However, countries lack enabling policies which would support such businesses to scale up. Fourth, on SDG 15, Life on Land. While the world is recovering from the impact of COVID-19, parts of the world were additionally bombarded with bouts of extreme weather conditions, from droughts and fires to severe flooding. While some of these were triggered naturally, it is undeniable that human actions ranging from deforestation to irresponsible agricultural practices play a huge role. Against this backdrop, the successful actualization of the Glasgow Leaders' Declaration on the Forest and Land Use adopted during COP26 is highly pertinent. ASEP is committed to contributing to this cause through our upcoming project on nature-based solutions, which aims to enhance the exchange of technical knowledge in protecting, sustainably managing, and restoring natural and modified ecosystems. The project will conduct a systematic survey of nature-based solutions interventions in the ASEM region, contributing to Urban Nature Atlas, the most comprehensive database of nature-based solutions for cities created to date. Finally, on SDG 17, Partnerships for the Goals. It is important to acknowledge that the 2030 Agenda and its 17 goals deal with highly complex and interconnected issues. The COVID-19 pandemic highlighted the need for global cooperation, collaboration, and equally important, empathy. To enhance the dialogue among all the stakeholders with empathy is more than ever important to tackle such a deepened complexity. Only then are we closer to make the pledge, leave no one behind, a reality. With that, I look forward to learning from all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for your opening remarks. And I would like also to thank again all the distinguished speakers for their opening statements. Now I would like to introduce the UNOSD consultant, Mr. Darren Swanson, who has been working with UNOSD and providing support regarding the organization and holding the Sustainable Development Forum for a few years in the past. We're happy to see him again this year. So Darren, I think I will leave it to you now. Are you there?
Thank you very much, John, and welcome everybody, and thank you very much, distinguished speakers, for providing such an excellent opening to the session in the forum today. We have a good contingent of people online today in the forum from around the world, so welcome everybody. Today's forum, before we get into the speakers for today, and we have a great list of speakers as you can see from the agenda, we want to have as much interaction as possible in today's forum. So we're going to try to achieve that through a number of channels. We are going to use live polling to have some trivia questions on the Sustainable Development Goals to help warm us up for each session and each morning. We are, of course, going to have some question and answer for each of the speakers, a chance to delve further into their presentations. So you will have a chance in the chat space as the speakers are speaking. I encourage participants to post questions for the speakers, and we will have a chance to address a few after each talk. In addition, after presentation from the speakers will have a chance to ask you questions as participants through live polls on questions that relate to the presentation and help to amplify some key messages. And of course, we also have this year a discussion page, which we will give you some instructions for shortly about how to post your thoughts on today's theme. And we'll come to that in a brief moment. So I think just to get us started off, for the live polling that we're going to do today and the trivia questions, we are going to be using Slido. It's an on live polling system. And there's two ways that you can access this as a participant. One is if you have your phone handy, you can just hold your camera up and there'll be a barcode I'll show you when we reach the poll. And then you can scan that and it'll automatically take you to the poll. If you do not have your phone handy, you can still access the poll by opening up a browser on your computer, and we will give you a link and a code. So why don't we just warm up, get started a bit right now with a poll question. And this will allow everybody just to get a chance. We'll start off with a really I think a fairly easy question. So for those of you that have your phone handy, you can scan, hold your camera up to the barcode, and a yellow button should show up and you can scan and it'll take you right to the poll on your phone. And again, if you don't have your phone handy, you can go to slido.com on a browser and just type in SDTF 2022 when you hit that screen, and it'll take you right to the poll. So I can see a number of people have already found their way to the poll right now and are taking a chance to answer the question. Of course, as we heard in the opening address, the Sustainable Development Goals, of course, part of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, adopted in 2015. And of course, we had a number of goals, part of the Sustainable Development Goals, a number of targets, of course. And as you're getting, as we're just getting more people participating in the poll right now, of course, 2015 was quite a landmark year for member states of the United Nations and citizens of the world as we had the 2030 Agenda adopted. We also had the Paris Agreement in that year, 2015. We had an agreement on financing for international development and also an agreement on disaster risk reduction. So it was quite a landmark and watershed year for the UN system toward sustainable development and resilience. All right, so I see a number of people have found their way to the poll. Let's just take a quick peek here. And yes, indeed, it was a bit of a trick question. We'll admit, bit of a trick question. There are 17 global sustainable development goals, but there are 169 targets that are part of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development that support the Sustainable Development Goals. So thank you, everybody, for taking part in the poll. And I guess you're getting a chance to get warmed up and find out how to access. If you're having a bit of trouble, you can send a text message or a chat message to us, and we'll try to help you out. Okay, one more question here, just to get a little bit more difficult now, getting to the topic of the day. Quality education, of course. We had a number of our opening speakers set the stage for today's theme on quality education. And we have a true and false question for you here today. So again, the poll will show up. If you had it open on your phone, it will have automatically advanced to the next poll question. And same on your internet browser if you're using your computer. You can also put in the code again, but it will follow along. As we proceed through the polls, it will advance automatically for you. So true and false question for you. So as of 2019, 67% of schools in the least developed countries had access to electricity. Is this true or false? I'll leave you in suspense for a few moments as people log in their answers and get used to using the polling function. But of course, as we know from the progress on the Sustainable Development Goals, that the impact of COVID-19, the pandemic on schooling was a generational catastrophe. This information is summarized on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals site. And of course, we did learn through progress that before the pandemic, progress was already slow in achieving the education targets. And the school closures that caused by the pandemic have really had devastating consequences for children's learning and well-being. So we're seeing we get good participation on the poll right now. Let's take a peek at what is happening here. Let's take a look at the answer. We had a good proportion of the people picked up on the trick question. This indeed is false. On the progress site for Sustainable Development Goal number 4 on the 2030 Agenda website, you will see this as a summary statistic. And in fact, it's quite the opposite. In fact, 60% of schools in the least developed countries do not have access to electricity. And of course, this highlights the importance of the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals and SDG number 4. All right, thank you very much, everyone, for participating in this poll. Again, if you're having difficulty, send us a chat. We'll try to help you out along the way, but we will be using this throughout the forum and throughout the week. And one more aspect before we get started here for the speakers for the session today. We have a discussion page set up right now on the software called Padlet. And the link is in your chat space. This is a board, a poster board, discussion board where you can share information to the forum. And this information, we will be talking about it in discussion sessions throughout today and the week. And we will also be summarizing this information in the forum report. So we're asking you to share with us four different pieces of information. On this webpage, we'd like to learn about good practices towards Sustainable Development Goal number 4 today. Examples of successes in achieving quality education, and this could be through policy, through programs, through technology, through efforts, partnerships to achieve goal number 4, quality education. We also want to learn about other things. We want to learn about your challenges, the lessons learned that you've had in trying to achieve quality education through your programs and policies and projects and technology. But we also want, in alignment with the theme of the forum, we would like to learn more about how COVID-19 has impacted quality education. This is an opportunity for you as participants to be able to share and post information. And finally, we also want to learn about how can society build back better to advance quality education. So this is a good opportunity for you to share your thoughts. This is a moderated page. So we have a moderator, our colleague Nurian from the Asia Europe Foundation, who is managing this page for the forum this week. Thank you very much, partners at ASEF. This will be a moderated page just to ensure that we don't have people hacking into the system and putting in inappropriate messages. So your messages will appear quite promptly throughout the course of today, and you can continue to add information after the session as well. So we look forward to receiving your input throughout the forum on this discussion page. So without further ado, let's launch into the program. And we have an excellent lineup of speakers here today for the next almost 2 hours now, and we will have a break partway through too to have a little bit of a stretch. We have today with us Mr. Manos Antoninis. He's the director of the team for the Global Education Monitoring Report with UNESCO, and we'll have a more detailed introduction here in a little bit. We also have Mr. Meuleman. We have Mr. Oliver Liang with us. We have Ms. Reka Tozsa and her colleague, Mr. Edizon Fermin. And we have Miss Alicia Quezada with us as well, joining us from all parts of the world. So welcome all speakers, and now we'll get a chance to more properly introduce each of you. So without further ado, let's launch into our first speaker for today, Mr. Manos Antonini. Manos, thank you so much for joining us today. Manos is the director of the Global Education Monitoring Report at the United Nations Education, Scientific and Cultural Organization. And of course, we know it as UNESCO. He is also currently a co-chair for the Technical Cooperation Group on Indicators for SDG on Quality Education. And prior to UNESCO, Manos worked for 10 years on public finance and monitoring and evaluation projects in education in such locales as Bangladesh, China, Indonesia, and Nigeria. And Mr. Antoninis, he holds a PhD in economics from the University of Oxford and is specialized in technical education and the labor markets. Thank you very much, Manos. And you will be talking today directly to the subject of the forum. And please, the floor is yours. And we will allow you to transition to sharing your screen. If you are you sharing slides with us, Mr. Antoninis?
Yes, I will. Thank you so much. And despite this description, I think you almost got me with your test. In the end, I think I got it right, but I had to cheat a little bit. It's right. So thank you so much for your kind invitation today to be with you and to share with you a few thoughts about how the Global Education Monitoring Report has been addressing the issue of the review of SDG 4 last time and thoughts about this time. So I'm sharing my screen with you and bother you here. So a couple of words first about the Global Education Monitoring Report. For those of you who may not be familiar with it, it is a report that exists now for 20 years. It is an editorially independent report hosted and published by UNESCO, which in Incheon, which would have been great to be there with you today, received a global mandate in 2015, this time from the world's governments, because it was proven to be a successful experiment to do two things: to monitor education progress in the SDGs, and that's SDG 4, but also education in the other SDGs. That explains why each report has a monitoring part. And secondly, to monitor the implementation of national and international strategies to achieve SDG 4 as they are outlined in the Framework for Action, which is the main document as a roadmap for achieving SDG 4. And that explains why we have a thematic part which is intended to help hold all partners to account for their commitments made in 2015. This here is the set of reports that we have launched since 2015 on themes like education and the other SDGs, accountability, migration and displacement, inclusion, and the last report launched just a couple of months ago on non-state actors in education. Now, when it came to review SDG 4 for the first time in 2019, we did two things. The first is, of course, the quantitative monitoring. In a report we did jointly with the UNESCO Institute for Statistics, we reviewed progress in all SDG 4 targets and global indicators. And here are a few headlines about where the world stood just before the pandemic in 2020. As you see, out-of-school rates, more than 1 in 3 adolescents of upper secondary school age are out of school. And only 1 in 2 were completing secondary education, at least in time, a few more complete, but many years over age. As you already heard, of those who reach the end of primary education, only 1 in 2 achieve the minimum level of proficiency in reading and mathematics. And progress is quite slow. It tends to be about 0.5 percentage points per year on average. 1 in 4 children of 1 year younger than primary school age actually do not attend preschool. And in terms of the financing commitments, 1 in 3 countries spend less than both the two benchmarks that have been set, 4% of GDP or at least 15% of total public expenditure. 1 in 5 teachers in primary education are not trained according to national standards. And on equity, while we have made progress overall, on average, there are many, in terms of gender equality, there are many disparities if we look at individual countries, especially in secondary completion. And just think of that statistic, only 1% of the poorest girls complete secondary school in low-income countries, when our commitment was that all of them would by 2030. And combining some of this information is also particularly powerful in terms of understanding where we are. While 1 in 4, as you see this graph, 1 in 2 children worldwide achieve the minimum learning proficiency in the world. But if you take into account that some do not finish primary school, not at least in time, then only 43% do so globally. These numbers are exacerbated in when you look in Africa, and further when you look in lower secondary education. By the end of lower secondary education, only 1 in 4 students achieve minimum proficiency. But if you take into account the fact that the majority do not reach that stage, only 1 in 10 of adolescents complete the lower secondary school in time and achieve what is expected in terms of learning outcomes. A major challenge, therefore, ahead of us, which has not been made any easier by the effects of COVID-19. Between March 2020 and October 2021, over this year-and-a-half period, schools were closed or partially closed for 55% of days of instruction. School closures were extremely long in countries like Bangladesh, Kuwait, the Philippines, and Venezuela. They were shortest in Oceania and also followed by Sub-Saharan Africa. But many countries kept schools open for less than 5% of days in large parts of Latin America, but also Bahrain, India, and Iran, for example. And this is a major challenge because we know that at least 463 million children could not access remote learning, especially in low or middle-income countries. And as a result, learning losses are a main concern in these days. Estimates vary between contexts, school levels, and subjects. In the global north, we know, for instance, that primary school pass rates in the United States were by 4 points in reading and by 10 points in mathematics when students moved to fully virtual context. In Italy, similar estimates of learning loss, 9% fell below minimum proficiency in reading and mathematics, and these tended to be good performing children of less educated parents who took the strongest blow. But the main concerns are really about low and especially middle-income countries, where learning losses appear to be larger, as examples from Kenya and Brazil show. In this graph, you see a comparison of the percentage of children who were able to reach a very simple text, lower than the level, at different grades, from grade 1, grade 8. And you see that they were particularly, the losses were largest at grades 4 and 5. And this is where why there's a call for increased attention for remedial efforts to help learners catch up, because this is a substantial learning loss given how many days of instruction these children lost. To strengthen and in order to give an emphasis on the governance of our progress towards SDG 4, the Global Education Monitoring Report and the UNESCO Institute for Statistics have been trying for a number of years to help fulfill a commitment that was first made by the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon in 2014, calling for benchmarking for progress, which the education sector adopted in its framework for action when it had called on all countries to set appropriate intermediate benchmarks. With our community, an intergovernmental group, the Technical Cooperation Group on SDG 4 Indicators, we identified 7 indicators that were suitable for benchmarking. And we tried to bring to the education sector the national determined contribution, this concept that has characterized climate change so effectively, and help bring together national, regional, and global education agendas. 2 in 3 countries participated and engaged in this process by submitting benchmarks nationally or by contributing through the regional monitoring frameworks in the Caribbean and in Europe. And also a number of countries are still submitting benchmarks as we speak, indicating their willingness to do so. We just sent a communication to all countries encouraging those that have not yet submitted, 1 in 3 countries, to do so, although we already have information for some of those from their national plans, because countries were encouraged not to come up with new targets, but to simply communicate and share with the rest of the world targets that they already have from their national education sector plans. This information you can find in this report that we launched in January on International Day of Education, and also in a new website, the Global Education Observatory, which dedicates a page to SDG 4 benchmarks, a major effort to help maintain commitment to our common agenda in education. Now, quantitative information is of course very important, but it's not enough. In 2019, we had a companion publication that focused on the qualitative aspects. What are countries doing to promote SDG 4? And to do so, we categorized the range of policies that countries are implementing in 6 groups. Because SDG and the SDG 4 in particular call on countries to move beyond average, to focus on equity and inclusion, to move beyond basics. What is the content that is fit for sustainable development? And Ambassador Morikawa said very aptly today that the need for education to support peace and human rights is more relevant than ever today. Beyond education, which invites countries to think beyond the confines of the Ministry of Education and think of links with other sectors. Beyond access, because as you saw in my presentation, there is a need to emphasize quality and learning outcomes. Beyond schooling, because education is not only delivered in schools, an agenda of lifelong learning. And finally, beyond countries, things like what we do today, reaching out beyond our national confines to talk with our partners at regional and global level. And I'm finishing my talk with an example on the cross-sectoral collaboration that the GEM report helps bring in its publications. In every publication, in every global report that is published about every 15 to 18 months, we have a chapter that is dedicated to the relationship between education and the other sustainable development goals. In the last publication, we focus on 3 SDGs, on sustainable energy, infrastructure, and production. And I'm going to mention one example. We know, for instance, that renewable energy jobs have grown from 7.3 million in 2012 to 16.5 million in 2021, and we'll need to reach 43 million by 2050 out of a total of 122 million jobs in the energy sector. That will be twice the share they have today. So what do we do? How can education and training help? The report has a range of examples of what partners do. For instance, the Energy Sector Management Assistance Program of the World Bank, in partnership with many other actors, supports energy transition activities, for instance, on clean cooking, on renewable energy, on electricity access, on decarbonization. Tuvalu, it helped develop the national utilities technical and institutional capacity. The International Renewable Energy Agency, whose numbers I used before to describe the growth of renewable energy jobs, has been training national experts in Eswatini to develop the Energy Master Plan. This is the kind of activities that education and training can help to link education with all the other SDGs. That brings me to the end of my presentation. I would like to thank you for listening, to remind you that the GEM report has a range of resources on issues like monitoring progress in education, comparing laws and policies in our peer website, highlighting education inequalities between and within countries in the wide website, and education estimates of flagship indicators like the completion or the out-of-school rate, which we have recently introduced. And thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manos, for setting the stage for us and providing us with a good backdrop from the reporting efforts that you're involved in at UNESCO. I'm just looking through. I know your presentation has already sparked some activity on the discussion page, the forum discussion page. So thank you, participants, for starting to share your quality education experiences. And also, too, we've got the chat space active now for participants. And I know people are going to take a while to get warmed up to the chat space for the questions. But Manos, I do have one question for you, and I know this was a big part of your presentation because you talked about this idea of course, setting benchmarks. And you described the process of setting benchmarks in education as this tool for monitoring progress. And so I was just hoping maybe you could just maybe tell us a bit more about the background and the next steps in relation to the benchmarks you mentioned.
Yeah, thank you, Darren. Indeed, we believe this is going to be a major opportunity to link our quantitative objectives with advances in policy. The way we have envisaged the national SDG 4 benchmarking process, as I mentioned, try to bring, see the connections with other sectors, and especially what the climate change sector has done, is to bring more coherence and increase accountability, but primarily offer opportunities for peer learning. We identified 7 benchmark indicators on early childhood attendance, on school attendance, on completion, on minimum proficiency levels in reading and mathematics, on trained teachers, and on gender gap in secondary education completion, and on public education expenditure. And we invited countries to set their targets or to share with the rest of the world their targets on these 7 indicators that no one can claim that they can manage their education system without. So nothing, there was no additional request or that any country could not possibly meet. Although, of course, learning outcome information is only now growing once the 2030 agenda put learning outcomes at the center. So the idea is to help countries share these objectives, their targets for 2025 and 2030, and with our support in monitoring and communicating those, as we did in our baseline report this January, to encourage countries to compare their experiences and say, how exactly are you going to achieve these targets? Why are some countries achieving better progress? What are the lessons that we can potentially learn? When we review the SDG 4 this year, our aim is to highlight all countries' targets. As I said, currently we have requested countries to submit the remaining countries to submit their benchmark indicators for 2022 by May. But we are going to have a publication that will showcase and highlight a dozen countries around the world which have done this exercise really well. They have identified the targets for all indicators, and they have explained how these targets are actually linked to their policies. Because there's no point stopping at the quantitative level. The whole point is to show how countries are planning with evidence to achieve their targets and which policies they put in place to do so. And that, we think, will be a formative aspect that all countries need, and especially when it is shared at regional and global level. So we're looking forward to this exercise being completed. Already we have received a lot of support, and this week the UNESCO Institute for Statistics Director, our partner in this process, is presenting the case, and there's going to be a resolution at the UN Statistical Commission meeting that has already received considerable support and attention by countries.
Excellent. Thank you for that elaboration. And of course, yeah, the whole manage what you measure part is obviously the quite the critical piece for moving forward. And I think you noted too, it provides a center of gravity for partnerships too, when we have that sort of foundation for the benchmarking process. So it serves so many different purposes. Thank you very much. I see some more. We are going to move on to some questions that you want to pose to the participants. But there will be, I think, a few questions that might appear in the chat space, Manos. And if you're online with us for a while, you may want to monitor that. And if they're answerable in tweet-like form, you may wish to respond via the chat space to participants as they pose their additional questions that we don't get a chance to address here. But let's move on to just a quick interaction with participants here. You were asking a bit about the 6 beyonds, I think, in terms of which of the 6 beyonds just presented are you most interested as a qualitative measure of progress in education? Can you set this one up a bit for us, a bit more?
So yes, I can explain. So our publication for the 2019 HLPF invited countries to showcase which policy in these 6 categories they were essentially championing to demonstrate best their commitment to SDG 4. So we asked them for policies beyond access, meaning those that were focusing more on quality and learning. Beyond education, meaning those that were putting not just education at the center, but the links between education and the other sectors, the other sustainable development goals. Beyond basics, that meant it wouldn't be just about literacy and numeracy, but about all those concepts, particularly those linked to Target 4.7, that prioritize global citizenship and sustainable development. Beyond schooling was the dimension of lifelong learning, recognizing how governments recognize that a lot of learning happens actually outside the school context. Beyond averages was the concept of equity and inclusion, because the SDGs have really called on us not to think just of the average progress in countries, but the inequalities within them. And beyond countries, which dimensions of their policies countries are engaging with other partners outside their borders. We know education is a prerogative of national governments. No country particularly wants to discuss with others how they run their education, but increasingly, through comparative information, we do see engagement in peer learning mechanisms that help influence thinking about what needs to happen in different contexts. So these were 6 potential ways of thinking of what the SDGs are bringing to the education policy-making process. And that's what I thought it would be an interesting way to think of how countries. So as you see this poll, think of the opposite. It's not about access, it's beyond access. It's about quality and learning. Beyond schooling means non-formal and informal forms of learning. Beyond education, meaning thinking of health, social protection, other targets and how they help promote our thinking. Beyond averages, I already said, inequalities. Beyond countries, thinking of regional platforms.
That's good. Yeah, so good. Thank you, participants of the forum, for weighing in. You guys, you see the access is something that's on everyone's minds, and I think everyone's experienced that sort of in quite directly, or rather quite directly, indirectly in their own lives. So, Manos, can't thank you enough for starting us off here today, and for elaborating on the questions and providing us with this discussion through the live poll with participants. And so just on behalf of everyone, just thank you very much, and I hope you can stay on with us for a bit here as long as possible as we do more interaction, and do participate in the chat space if you do see some questions for you.
Yeah, could I briefly respond to the 2 questions I see on the chat? I see Alicia asked whether any least developed country avoided learning loss.
I think we'll have to move on, Manos, just on time. But do please interact with Alicia through the chat space, and we could come back to that too. We will have, if we can, a bit of a synthesis discussion at the end too, where we can tie in some of these. So if you can hang on with us, we can have more opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manos. All right. Moving on to, of course, staying on the theme of quality education, of course, that's the theme of today for the forum. We continue to have more different perspectives from experts from around the world. And we have joining us today, Mr. Louis Meuleman. Louis, thank you for joining us. Louis is currently Vice Chair of the United Nations Committee on Experts on Public Administration, and he's a member of the Scientific Committee of the European Environment Agency. He is a visiting professor of public governance at KU Leuven University in Belgium, and is also co-founder of the consultancy Public Strategies for Sustainable Development. Louis holds a PhD in public administration and a Master of Science in environmental biology, so got real cross-section of perspective to draw on from his expertise. And his latest book on meta-governance is out in 2018, published through Routledge, so encourage people to Google that, and you will have an interesting read on your hands for sure. Louis, thank you so much. You're going to talk to us about building forward and the effective, accountable, and inclusive governance for quality education. So thank you very much, Louis, and the floor is yours. And I understand you won't be sharing slides, so I'll just leave your picture here up on the screen.
Very much, Darren. Distinguished excellences, speakers and participants and friends, so good to see so many of you again. It's a great pleasure to be able to share some thoughts here again on SDG 4 in a time, and it was mentioned before, where SDG 16 on peace and institutions implementation is clearly needed. And okay, these are very difficult times. I will speak a bit about effectiveness, accountability, and inclusive governance for quality education, SDG 6. SDG 4 would also have been fitted well. I'm speaking to you from a hospital in Brussels. I can show you that it's really true. Doesn't matter, but this is my hospital room, and the good thing is I just got my release paper, so after today I can go. I just had an infection. This was not COVID, but it was also not so nice. But I learned a lot about education, health systems, and there are interesting parallels between education and health systems. One is, and I've described this also in my PhD a bit more elaborate, that the fact that nurses and doctors, like teachers, are so-called street-level bureaucrats. They fulfill public functions, privatized or not, but I call them public functions, in direct contact with citizens. They need to be able to take decisions immediately in unexpected situations, undescribed situations. They need, therefore, the skills and the mindset and the courage to explore unwritten territory. And their discretionary power must allow this, and they also need to be self-conscious about that. Therefore, my first recommendation, and I will have only 3 recommendations. The first recommendation is that education systems for SDG 6, for the education systems need to prepare people for such jobs as street-level bureaucrat type, including also police. And I think that could be a really good addition. Secondly, as a member of the United Nations Committee of Experts on Public Administration, I helped develop the 11 principles of effective governance for sustainable development. They are very useful. Several African countries, for example, are using them. See a baseline study made by the African Peer Review Mechanism recently. And these principles follow the structure offered by SDG 16.6 on the quality of public institutions. And it's all about effectiveness, accountability, and inclusiveness. And some will notice here that efficiency is not one of these three headline principles. And that's a good thing that it's noticed and that it is not one of the principles. Efficiency is great, but may not become dominating effectiveness, accountability, or inclusiveness. In a way, there's a hierarchy. You cannot put efficiency at the top, because then you may get to organizations, to institutions, to systems, school systems also, that are efficient but not effective. Unfortunately, in some countries, the functioning of education systems has decreased because this long-term focus on cost efficiency. My second recommendation would therefore be that it would be good to base quality education governance on these 11 principles under the three headline principles of effectiveness, accountability, and inclusiveness. And also have a look at the Policy Coherence for Sustainable Development framework of SDG 1714.1, the indicator there, where it becomes clear how important, for example, also a good monitoring mechanism is for to create effective governance. I think the SEPA principles and the 8 dimensions of PCSD, they go along very well together. COVID-19 has aggravated the condition of education systems where they were already very weak. It was kind of stress test for higher education systems globally, forcing many countries to distance learning. But that required digital connectivity, which is often not available. In a paper on institutional aspects of the theme of the high-level political forum of this year, the SEPA committee elaborates on this with many examples my colleagues have gathered. And the paper is already online on UNDESA SEPA website, available because we will discuss this in the 21st session of SEPA between 4 and 8 April. And yeah, so everybody could see that paper. A few examples in short, but we just had heard from Manos Antoninis already more detailed numbers. That I will just give a few examples. I'm a bit running out of time, I think. In Asia, good development on child-friendly schools is reported from many countries, such as Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. And Sri Lanka has the highest reported youth literacy rate in South Asia at 98.7%. All good examples in our paper are followed by a big but, because there's always also a critical side. Sub-Saharan Africa does well in general, but also has the highest number of out-of-school children. And in Latin America, another example, only 25% of poor households are connected to the internet and have a mobile device. A country like Bolivia had to suspend schooling because of the impossibility of maintaining it online. And that's, of course, a big issue. My last remarks are on the 2 phases of digitalization, you could say. Everybody is very enthusiastic about digitalization normally, and there are huge funds being put in that. And for education, it is and has proven to be very, very important. But there's also some buts here. Social media platforms have become the main source of news and communication for young and old people. They are great accelerators of information and knowledge, but they also are fake news providers. They are effective, yes, but are they accountable? Not. Are they inclusive? It seems so, but it can also be fake. A rapidly growing concern is then therefore how social media platforms, among others in education, can undermine democratic institutions if not sufficiently regulated. And this is also part of SEPA's recommendations to the HLPF. Therefore, my third and last recommendation would be start discussion on regulation of social media and ensure that they are not only effective, but also accountable and inclusive. These were already the 3 points. I used a little bit time that I had. I hope you don't mind. So I had 3 recommendations. The first one is about that education systems need to provide for the skills, mindsets, and courage that the street level bureaucrats need, that helps teachers, doctors, nurses, policemen, etc., to do their work better. Second was that base quality education governance on the 11 SEPA principles of effective governance for sustainable development under the 3 SDG 16 headlines, principles of effectiveness, accountability, and inclusiveness, and also link this to the 8 dimensions of policy coherence for sustainable development. And finally, the point on the undermining capacity of social media, which are unregulated for and threat to our democratic institutions. That was all. Thank you for listening.
Excellent. Louis, as always, thank you very much for covering lots of territory and going into good depth and insightful depth. I particularly appreciate how you really took your context in the hospital and linked it with, frontline street level bureaucrats in the health and education sectors. So thank you for tying in your immediate context, and glad you got the release papers. You had touched on something, well, many interesting things. One in particular, you touched in on the aspect of social media and regulation. Interestingly, I'll be helping chair a United Nations model General Assembly coming up here in North America, where we've got high school students from across several provinces and states. And in fact, one of the resolutions they're going to be debating is about the regulation of social media for ensuring safeguarding democracy. Did you want to elaborate just a bit more on this? I mean, it's a big topic, but regulating social media, are there some sort of top level areas that will be discussed in that context?
Oh, that's very difficult. It is an issue that is there already. There is already literature about that. Studies have been done. But in the general minds of people, I think the enthusiasm about social media has dominated the risks. And some examples recently, the truck drivers' protests in Canada and France and other countries were clearly organized through fake social media accounts, it seems. And there are so many other examples that also now in the time of this terrible war, social media have played a role. And there has been a resistance for a long time to regulate that. I know the European Commission is one of the government levels that is trying a bit more to do that. But I think we should first have a good discussion. And it's great that you are involved in organizing a bigger discussion on that soon. The funny thing is that I came to this point, which was I suggested as a key point to the 23 other members of SEPA recently. And first some said, well, yeah, but social media is so good. And a couple of weeks later, everybody said, this is important, we have to do that. So that went very fast, but it came to me not because I just read it in an article and thought about it. No, there was a group of young students, bachelor students, who consulted me about the project. And they were just doing this. They were studying this and how to use social media in a positive way for sustainable development, but they stumbled upon the negative side immediately. So, and I'm coaching them now a bit. But we are at the beginning, I think, and this could go very quickly, and it needs fast development.
Yes, it is a fast moving area, and obviously, yeah, quite urgent for the evidence and the facts. Louis, thank you very much. So that was encourage the participants too to place questions in the chat space. And if Louis, if you're still online for a while, and if there's tweet-like responses there that you can offer to participants, they surely appreciate that. And I see also Manos has been active on the chat here, responding to a number of questions that got posed to him as well. But you have a question, Louis, for participants. This is in this poll question, so participants, this should appear on your live poll on your device. But Louis would like to ask, and Louis can elaborate a bit on this here. Just a quick sort of sense from participants. In your country, what do you think the first priority should be, the first governance priority should be for building forward quality education? So I guess in other words, I mean, what area is perhaps the weakest in your country and where activity is needed? So that's another way to look at the question. And Louis, you may want to expand on it here as you see the results come pouring in.
Yeah, in the first place, I wrote building forward quality education, not building back, because I think that that's a framing that everything will be the same as in the past, only better, but I'm not sure. The systems will be different in the future. So building forward is a better framing. And I think I gave already, I already explained why efficiency is not one of the suggested top priorities. And what I'm seeing now is that accountability is a bit less. I understand that, yes, but it's in any case, it's there. Accountability is very important. If I had had more time, I could have said something about accountability systems under different governance regimes in different cultures in different countries, where you can have top-down institutions for accountability, or outsourced, or participatory approaches. That's all possible. But yeah, I think all three are important to take on board and never leave one of them out. And I'm happy to see inclusiveness, the last thing I wanted to say, as the number one here, because, most people will not even have seen, I suppose, the 11 principles of effective governance from SEPA, but 5 of the 11 are about inclusiveness. And that is not an issue that is usually in classical World Bank or OECD lists of governance principles a big part. Normally, inclusiveness is not even there. So I think that's a big difference of the SDGs, of the 2030 agenda, and I'm happy that it is recognized.
Yes, indeed, and good that participants have obviously picked up on that aspect. So thank you everybody for providing some input back into Louis and Louis, the principles for effective governance. If you have time to throw that into the chat space, a link for participants, and I'll get that resource put up too on the forum website as well, and making sure people have access to it in the forum report. So Louis, again, on behalf of everybody, thank you very much for sharing your time with us today, and hope you can stick around for a little bit before you leave the environs that I'm sure you're glad to be leaving, but happy to have been there. Thank you. All right, everybody, thank you very much for participating in the polls, and also encourage you to go to the chat space as well for questions, and then Louis will be on hand, and Manos as well, and also to the forum discussion page to share examples of practices and successes for achieving quality education, plus the lessons you've been learning, how COVID has been impacting on your efforts on quality education, and also the ideas for building back better or building forward, as Louis had just framed it for us. Next up, moving forward, we're going to keep the train moving here in this forum. And next up, we have Mr. Oliver Liang with us here to share his perspective. Oliver is the head of the public and private services units of the sectoral policies department at the International Labour Organization. We know it as ILO. So together with UNESCO, he coordinates the secretariat of the joint ILO-UNESCO Committee of Experts on the Status of Teaching Personnel, and promotes standards on education and teachers. He also works on labor issues related to health, culture, and sport sectors, as well as sustainable consumption. And Mr. Liang has previously served as Manager of Development Cooperation Policy at ILO and is coordinator of the information services on the ILO standards, on the International Labor Standards. And Oliver holds a PhD from Johns Hopkins University and will be talking to us today about the promise and perils of post-pandemic education. Oliver, welcome. Floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Darren, and hello, everyone. It is really a pleasure to be here. It is my first day back in the ILO office after several months of home telework, so it's an exciting day for me, and I'm glad to join you from my office today. As Darren pointed out, I had a team that deals with conditions of service workers, including health workers, but also public servants and education workers. For those of you who don't know the ILO, and there might be some, we are a United Nations agency dealing with labor issues. We are a bit unique in the UN system because we are tripartite in nature, which means we bring together not only governments, usually represented by labor ministries, but also employers and workers organizations to devise international standards and policy on labor matters. And in that sense, education is for us not only a human right, but it is also an important economic sector, which employs millions of people as teachers and education workers. Now, the ILO does work on education in a few particular areas, notably the fight against child labor. And of course, we also deal a lot with TVET, apprenticeship, skills, and lifelong learning. My particular take on this is the work I do together with UNESCO in support of teachers and other education workers on the basis of the 1966 ILO UNESCO recommendation concerning the status of teachers. This is an international standard that is to date the only one really talking about teachers, and I'll put the link where you can find all this in the chat in a second. We also support the UNESCO 1997 recommendation concerning higher education teaching personnel, which is a great standard as well by UNESCO, but which draws a lot on ILO labor standards as well. So from this perspective, my work basically deals with making sure that teachers enjoy decent labor rights, adequate wages, training, professional development, but also most very importantly, freedom of association and collective bargaining. In other words, the right also to have a voice in the determination of their professional and working conditions. Now, why is this so important? Well, I'm going to talk to you today very briefly about two meetings the ILO recently had. The first was during our International Labor Conference last year, when there was a discussion about education, training, lifelong learning, and particularly in the response to building back forward, as we just heard, to the pandemic. And I think what was clear for all of our constituents, so the labor ministries, but also the government, the workers and the employers, is that lifelong learning and skills were an essential strategy. They were an essential strategy for addressing exclusion, for addressing inequality, for enabling individuals to acquire skills, capabilities, and qualifications to get jobs, to become active members of the labor market. And they called for a number of important strategies in this regard, including, for example, the coordination and identification of skills gaps and learning needs, including through social dialogue with employers and workers organizations. They emphasized a big investment in core skills, including social and emotional skills, cognitive skills, digital skills, and skills relevant to environmentally sustainable economies. And they really emphasized that education skills and lifelong learning were a key strategy to economic recovery, transitioning people into the labor market, and also adapting to the rapidly changing needs of the labor market, which we've seen in the last 20 years, which have been brought about by things like digitalization, automation, globalization, and big demographic shifts. And of course, and I think it goes without saying, education and lifelong learning are going to be big strategies for also addressing the climate crisis and adjusting our economy so that and our cultures so that we can live carbon free in a socially just manner. So these are big promises. These are big demands on education system. But how about the workers that have to develop and have to deliver on this important SDG? And it's on this that I'd like to just share a few thoughts that we've gotten from another meeting we had very recently on the future of education, the future of work in the education sector, and some research we've done, especially on digitalization efforts in Africa and in Europe. So what is clear is that teachers are going to have many, many more demands coming up on them in the new education paradigm, especially the one that's emerging now after the pandemic. Teachers are going to have to teach these new skills like creativity, innovation, critical thinking, and problem solving, communication, teamwork, all these famous 21st century skills or core skills, which will require additional training. They will have to address new topics like climate change, global citizenship, even pandemic response, because we know a lot of teachers were responsible for a lot of the health issues arising in schools. They will have to deal with not only physical health, but sexual health, mental health, and the latter I think is extremely important in view of the emerging mental health crisis among young people today. We heard a little bit about accountability. Teachers today are indeed bureaucrats. They are burdened with enormous administrative tasks of reporting and testing. They're subject to a lot of occupational safety and health risks, not only COVID, but unfortunately violence, including online harassment. And then with technology, there come a whole bunch of new challenges. We have seen that digitalization has leapfrogged during the pandemic, and even countries that were fairly behind in digitalization before suddenly invested massively in this. And I think Manos has given us some statistics about how this was done, either through online learning, but also things like telephones and radio. And the research that we've done initially now together with the German Development Cooperation has shown that this has had enormous promises. I mean, certainly it can make content and lesson plans, testing and grading available to teachers, but also, of course, learners in very remote areas. It can offer many solutions and provide a lot of content to people who did not have that content before. It also, however, raises a number of issues, and I think Professor Meuleman already raised some of those about what happens when you let the digital enter the education world, which is ultimately a public good. Of course, teachers are going to need support. They're going to need training on these new technologies. Digitalization has increased workloads for teachers because they often have not only to prepare for presential learning, but also for digital learning. It creates expectations to be online and available more. So this right to disconnect has come up. It raises important questions about procurement, public procurement, dependencies on large multinational technological companies, e-waste and energy consumption. And above all, I think it also raises questions about the sovereignty of educational content. A lot of these platforms work or are delivered with educational content developed often by elites in the West, and how appropriate and how targeted these are for other populations who may want to control this remains a question. We've heard how, these technologies can connect you really to the brightest minds in the world, but they can also connect you very quickly to the worst minds in the world. And teachers are going to have to manage these ethical and social issues related to technology. So what it seems is, coming out of the pandemic with this massive emphasis on education and lifelong learning, with this massive emphasis on getting teachers to be able to bring students into the labor market, to adapt to changing labor conditions, but also to deal with a lot of the social and mental issues coming out of the pandemic, and to master digitalization, we are asking once again fairly low paid and sometimes poorly trained teachers to be superhumans, to be the nurse, the police, the administrator, the computer engineer, and the community leader all in one day. So what are some things we can do as we drive SDG 4 forward to make sure that we don't fall into these pitfalls? Well, the meeting that we had recommended that a big emphasis is placed on inclusiveness and equality in access to technology. This does not only mean for the learners, but also for the teachers, because the same divides, rural, urban, status, age, and gender, often apply to the teaching force as well. They recommended a heavy investment in teacher training to deal with the technologies, not only the technological issues, but also the ethical and social issues arising out of technologies. There was a big emphasis on the importance of student and educator data. One of the things that has been frightening is how education platforms are now also being used to monitor workers, including teachers, and including the content that teachers might be wishing to discuss with students. And especially in higher education, this has already raised some issues about academic freedom. The meeting emphasized the importance of teacher wages, that these should be similar to qualified professions. Even in the OECD, they tend to be somewhat lower than equally qualified professionals with the same degrees. There needs to be attention paid to hours of work to make sure that teachers have time to prepare for both online and face-to-face classes, and as well as work-life balance. And finally, there was a big emphasis on the importance of social dialogue. And this is what the ILO means by social dialogue, is the inclusion of the people who are affected in a labor condition in the discussion and setting of those conditions. That can be through collective bargaining, so through classic negotiations between teacher unions and governments or private educators, if that is the case. But it can also mean consultation or information sharing. And I think the evidence overwhelmingly shows that countries that take social dialogue seriously with teachers, that try to reform education systems with teachers, tend to do better. They avoid conflict, they avoid strikes, which can be extremely difficult for education systems, and they can bring in the knowledge that teachers have at the ground level, at the street level, as we heard, into the policy making. So these are some of the issues that came out of our meetings. I think I'll leave it at that. The idea that I wanted to develop here is that education has, after the pandemic, has new promises, a lot of potential, but there are some pitfalls, and social dialogue is one way to avoid them. Thank you very much.
Oliver, thank you very much. And I can really appreciate you bringing up this aspect of, so many more new skills, new topics that teachers are having to address. And this whole idea of needing to adapt to these changing conditions, that is going to be such a big part of the building forward aspect in all sectors. I like how you mentioned the sort of the superhuman, sort of all-encompassing capabilities have to sort of coalesce now, as the pandemic showed us how teachers have been having to play so many roles, and so it is a new world moving forward for certain. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to encourage participants to leave questions in the chat space. Oliver, I do want to move forward here to a question. You had provided us some stats here first. I want to kind of get into these quick. Put this on the screen now for participants, and then I'll come back to some questions here. You had so participants, if you look to your live poll right now, you'll see a question there that's sort of to highlight some more statistics here that are really quite relevant to set some context. So the question for participants right now: how many teachers are there worldwide, including early childhood education, of course, and tertiary? Just a sense for participants to get a sense for the global landscape. But Oliver, you had talked a bit about, of course, many aspects, but I'm wondering if you could expand a bit on, I guess, this idea of improved labor conditions and how that, could then help build forward education, the better education workforce. Some thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks. Well, we know that teacher motivation is a really important element in delivering quality educations. That's why the SDG does call for well-supported teachers. It's the idea that teaching is not just a kind of fast food job. It is a job that involves emotional work, it involves care work, it involves, of course, also a lot of intellectual work. So you really need highly motivated workers in that field for a relatively long period of time for a career. You don't want a lot of turnover or dropout in teachers. So working conditions is an essential attractor for teachers. We know that in sub-Saharan Africa, there is a lack of teachers. There will need to recruit millions of more teachers to achieve the 2030 goals. And one way to do that is to ensure wages that are at least commensurate with workers that have similar education, wages that are allow teachers to live on a teacher's wage, addressing issues like payment of wages, which is sometimes difficult in rural areas, but also addressing other working condition questions, for example, occupational safety and health, safety of teachers, for example, of being free from violence and harassment, which has been an issue in many areas, not to mention, of course, in crisis and conflict affected areas.
Excellent. Thanks for the elaboration, Oliver. And of course, just looking to the live poll right now, there was a split on the guesses. A number of people have picked various answers at 94. So you want to elaborate on this stat and set us up for the next question?
Well, I just wanted to emphasize that the 94 million, of course, is the global estimate that we have. That includes, of course, private teachers as well. It's just to emphasize those are a lot of workers. And many of them are highly unionized. So it is a workforce really to contend with, and governments would do well to engage in constructive dialogue with teachers.
Excellent. And you had a follow-up question here before we move on. And this obviously ties into the previous one, but you're kind of asking participants, how many more primary and secondary teachers will be needed to reach 2030 education goals? And this really ties into the first one about what is the workforce, and now how many more will be needed? So participants, wager your best guess on this one. And Oliver will sort of end us off here with just a comment on this in a moment. Oliver, I think there are a number of questions in the chat space for you, so I'm hoping you have a bit of time to just do some tweet-like responses. I think some people were looking for some links to some documents, and there were a couple of I think pretty quick questions there. If you have time to do a quick tweet-like answer, and participants would surely appreciate that. But back to the poll question here, quickly taking a peek. We've got this is an interesting stat you posed to us. Can you elaborate?
Well, this is UNESCO's stats, so I shouldn't take credit. This is something that they project from year to year, and I think if I hope Manos agrees, these are the latest figures. It is, of course, a very challenging number to reach the 2030 goals, and it means that recruitment of teachers, motivation of teachers, and retention of teachers remains a big challenge, and working conditions is going to be one of the key elements of that strategy. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much. A really nice way to sort of set the context and the reality of the situation. Oliver, thank you so much on behalf of everybody for sharing your insights and posing some questions to the participants. And I do see a lot of good examples being posted up to the forum discussion page on Padlet. So I encourage you to take a peek at that too, and even add any further information on there. Oliver, thank you very much. All right, colleagues, we are going to move on here. The train keeps moving here at this forum. We've got lots of excellent perspectives left ahead of us, and we're just going to keep moving forward here. We're going to keep this train moving. We have sort of a tandem presentation coming up next to round us off here on the home stretch of the forum here today. And we are very pleased to have Miss Reka Tozsa with us today from the Asia Europe Foundation, also a colleague of hers, Mr. Edizon Fermin. Reka leads the education and policy program area at Asia Europe Foundation, or ASEF for short, you may hear me mention. In her role, Reka leads ASEF's regional conference on higher education, also the higher education innovation laboratories and capacity building training for higher education professionals. In her early professional career with the Hungarian government, Ms. Tozsa was appointed to Chief of Cabinet of the Deputy State Secretary for Higher Education and to staff member of the Hungarian EU presidency. Ms. Tozsa obtained her degree in public administration from Corvinus University in Budapest and her MPA from the Liang Yu School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. So thank you very much, Reka. I will also introduce your colleague, Edizon, too, right now, and you guys can just kind of roll through in your presentation. Edizon is an advocate of equitable access to higher education. And he's been training teachers, supervisors, administrators in basic education, higher education, and technical vocational education for over 2 decades. And Edizon is currently the Vice President for Academic Affairs of National Teachers College in the Philippines. And he's also co-chair of the technical panel in teacher education with the Philippines Commission on Higher Education, as well as an expert resource for the technical working group on flexible learning. Dr. Fermin has attended the University of Edinburgh, where he was a 2019 Asia Europe Foundation training scholar. Thank you both, Reka and Edizon, for joining us today, and we look forward to hearing your perspectives.
Thank you so much for the very kind introduction, Darren. It's my pleasure to join the discussion and bring inclusion into the spotlight. Now, inclusion is the key to build back a better higher education system, or build forward higher education system, I should say. I think this phrase of Professor Louise Meuleman will be very catchy very soon. So why is it important to talk about inclusion? If we look at the definition of SDG 4, we see that inclusion and equity are core elements to it and go hand in hand with quality. And even though SDG 4 targets are focusing more on primary and secondary level of education, higher education has a lot to contribute. This evidence suggests that the more diverse, equitable, and inclusive a higher education system or institution is, the more creative and the more productive it becomes, which leads eventually to higher quality and better outcomes, not only in skill development and employment skills, but also producing better citizens who have more cultural understanding and are willing to promote peace and understanding and dialogue, which is so important nowadays, as pointed out by Ambassador Morikawa and Mr. Antoninis before as well. So higher education institutions were very ambitious. They took this seriously, put these values at the heart of their strategies, and made significant investment to go on this road. But then the COVID-19 pandemic hampered this progress. And even those students who would not have been considered as vulnerable before suddenly became at risk. And we know, because there is evidence, that students from disadvantaged backgrounds are even more impacted, and their progression into and through higher education is threatened the most. So this is the reason why the Asia Europe Foundation chose and diversity in the focus of its higher education work last year. And we produced 2 reports. This one, I refer to as a red report, is titled ARC 8, the Outlook Report 2030, which was looking at the risks and opportunities for inclusion and equity in higher education, and made several recommendations to policymakers and universities how to promote or advance these in the next decade, the final decade of the Agenda 2030. We worked with 25 wonderful experts on this report from 22 countries. So I encourage everyone to take a closer look at it. Other report we produced last year was titled ASEM national equity policies in higher education, with the participation of 47 governments. We were able to on how equity looks like in policy terms on the ground, and how are the countries dealing COVID. So in this presentation, I would like to share 3 points. That's 3 spotlights, which are building on the findings of these 2 reports. So first spotlight is the focus on student diversity. So it's a fact that completion rates and achievement levels at secondary education level are increasing, which leads more qualified people from different social backgrounds. And they bring with themselves different political views, social values, which often also manifest in different social movements, such as the Me Too campaigns or Black Lives Matter campaigns. And higher education institutions and systems sometimes struggle with these kind of phenomenon. And there is also evidence, at least from Europe, which suggests that students from minority and disadvantaged backgrounds feel less belonging to higher education, which can easily lead to not optimal higher education experience, non-optimal output, and earlier dropout. We also asked the policymakers, how do they think about the student body? Is it a homogeneous one, or do they differentiate different? This is that most of the countries participate. The 2 most common groups across Asia and Europe are the lower income or lower socioeconomic background students and students with disabilities. But we can see from this graph that there is a whole other group of potential student equity target groups, which are less considered, such as gender groups or older or mature students or refugees of all kinds. So based on these findings, this report, the Outlook Report 2030, made recommendations for policymakers to introduce performance agreements between universities and governments and specifically target relevant. So made recommendations for universities. Another very important recommendation was that it is not enough to have just equitable access policies without addressing success. So institutions have to make sure that these groups of students feel successful and are successful, which will eventually quality output. The second area, or the second spotlight, the policymakers and university leaders should look at when they are thinking about building back better, is how to handle into and through higher education is the most difficult from these minority and disadvantaged are the most threatened groups in times of disruptions. In terms of access, we have data from 2020 from the World Access Higher Education Survey that in 80% of the cases, university admissions were disrupted. And also in terms of success, these groups of students need a little bit more support, just starting with the digital divide. They are also more threatened with the loss of income because many of them have to work next to their higher education studies. And then we can go on to talk about mental health problems and the lack of supportive social networks. And then, of course, the long-term effects of the disruption that the student union also labeled this COVID generation. What will be the impact on this kind of we also asked the policymakers in this survey what kind of support the students, and good news that for applying non-monetary instruments such as preferential admission arrangements or national There are other policy tools which were less mentioned and food worth exploring, such as specific pathways to higher education or bridging programs. A lot of countries, luckily, were also offering monetary instruments such as scholarship and grants, and we were happy to see that the number of loans remained relatively low, very important in times of economic disruption as well. So the recommendation of the report for policymakers was that in building back better, they should really put and help the institutions to build. Universities, they could consider attaching funding to ensure that the progress made towards more equitable access and success is not hampered during time. And then the third and last spotlight that mentioned to is the collection of data, which might be the most technical, but we think this has a very great return on investment or a very great potential. Both the studies that we are building on now concluded that there are major gaps in understanding and major gaps in data, which was also a limitation to these studies. So it would be really essential to know more about the status quo and what's going on in higher education institutions, because if we can't learn more about these inequalities, then injustices may remain hidden. And also it's difficult to secure resources just simply for equitable access and success work if we don't have evidence to support it. We also asked the policymakers, what do they think about it, or what kind of actions are they taking? And majority of the countries who responded to this survey confirmed that they do collect data on all students, but when it came to the recommendation for policymakers in this third spotlight is really to try to explore the advancements of information technology, which might make data collection and integration easier, and also try to break down the silos or build synergies among different national surveys that could also contribute to this kind of data. And for universities, we really encourage them to explore how to do this best. There are a lot of cultural and legal barriers for sure. But like I said at the beginning of the spotlight, we think it really worth the investment. And these are the 3 takeaway points for you as well, and discussion points. Feel free to take a look at the report as well, because we also handled other areas in conjunction with inclusion, such as internationalization or inclusion in lifelong learning. Could be also nice food for thought for you. And I would like to give it over to my colleague, Dr. Edizon Fermin now, to share some more practical examples with us. How do these policy areas?
Thank you so much, Reka, and I hope that I'm coming in clear. I'd like to express my deep gratitude to the Asia Europe Foundation for having chosen the case of National Teachers College in our attempt to enable access to success during and beyond the pandemic. As shown on the next slide, National Teachers College was represented in the team on capacity building training for equitable access to higher education at the University of Edinburgh, just 2 months before news about the pandemic actually broke. And it was important for us to actually bring home the learnings and insights from this training. The next slide tells you that our institutional history dates back to 1928, being the first private school to offer teacher education in the Philippines. And currently we are nearly 16,000, covering kindergarten all the way to graduate education as of 2021. As also shown on the next slide, NTC is one of 7 institutions under the iPeople organization, which is managed by 2 of the largest conglomerates in the Philippines. We are currently serving over 54,000 students from kindergarten to doctoral programs. And on the next slide, where we show you our mission and vision, access and success are deeply ingrained in the way we operate as a system of schools, where education is key to transforming lives, especially through particular innovations in the way we deliver education and research. Additionally, as shown on the next slide, we wanted to actually be the institution known for best outcomes in employability, entrepreneurship, and applied research. But one may ask, what types of learners do we serve? And each particular school in the ecosystem caters to a different type and a different category of learners, ranging from socioeconomic clusters all the way to specializations in terms of employability pathways. But in the case of National Teachers College, as you will see on the next slide, the majority of our students, about 90% of them, belong to the low income and the lower middle income clusters of our economic situation. And the children of these households actually are regarded by their parents as their last ticket to enable themselves to get out of poverty. And largely because of the conditions that they are all part of, the aspiration to actually land a good job to enable the family to address its basic concerns insofar as their social and socioeconomic situation is concerned remains of great importance to our students. But the COVID-19 situation, as you note on the next slide, exacerbated the condition of these students, having had debilitating impact on the way they will continue their studies. But we were surprised that despite and in spite of this situation, our institutional agility to respond to what will likely become of these students who have a lot of social economic needs aside from their studies will engage in a situation of distance and remote learning, especially that a device and of course internet connectivity are considered luxuries for these students. Well, we were quite surprised that given the access options that we have put in place, you will note on the next slide that instead of being one of many higher education institutions in the Philippines where enrollment went down, the total enrollment of National Teachers College actually grew even much faster than we imagined from the time the pandemic struck all the way to the previous academic year 21-22. The sudden growth is actually attributed to the fact that we have opened gateways for students to continue their education by trying to understand their different challenges. And for us, this is our recipe of some sort to ensuring that students are encouraged to continue their studies despite the gloomy situation around the country. And if you notice on the next slide, what we did was to systematically profile our students using a lot of robust data gathering techniques from the ground. And we arrived at 3 categories of learners in terms of their connectivity first and foremost, because we were certain that can be the easiest way to deliver the continuity of learning. But we were saddened by the fact that nearly 60% of our students belong to categories 1 and 2. And this is when we had to rethink how we are going to address the other sources of access-related problems of our students. And what we found out, as shown on the next slide, is that aside from connectivity, the diverse challenges of our students are stemming from the fact that first and foremost, they needed to secure food for their family members because they're more able and capable. But to do that, they had to find jobs to support their families. And then secondary to that, their studies. It's really survival first and foremost. But to enable them to make hard decisions to continue striking the balance between a job and their studies, they needed an education ecosystem where there's a lot of flexibility. And part of that flexibility is that they will not be constrained to access devices and connectivity that are extra expenses to begin with. And ultimately, as we have noted in the last 2 academic years, they had the special need to be well, both for study and, of course, their work. And we borrowed a lot of processes in terms of customer understanding and insightful data mining. And to the point that Reka mentioned earlier, this is the time when we have to systematically manage available data for educational institutions, largely because of the agility, again, of our system to find the significant data points to make decisions. We arrived at 3 important milestones that help us envision ourselves capable of coping continuously even beyond the pandemic. And the next slide shows you the first thing that we did after looking at the data sets available to us. We had to reconceive products and markets relative to distance learning. We found from our insightful data mining strategies that students currently in this situation are experiencing a lot of boredom, ineffectiveness, and frustration. And so this led to our academic teams, as shown on the next slide, to focus on the customer experience, and contrary to the belief of other nations, it's about the technical platforms. What we ended up with was to focus on a universal learning platform easily accessible with less bandwidth for students. But the key to that is to design the learning experience in a very streamlined manner, and echoing the point of our ILO co-lead, to really concentrate on industry outcomes needed by the changing employability space. And of course, a third dimension of this is that we needed to capacitate our professors on what we call as experiential and low-tech enabled distance learning model. And so the second milestone, as shown on the next slide, is that we had to redefine productivity in our value chain by first and foremost transitioning teachers to digital learning. We primarily work with Google Workspace for Education, and our allied telecommunications company, a sister company of the conglomerate or under the conglomerate, offered us some packages that will help our faculty members and eventually our students continue engaging in some form of technology-enabled learning, but not much of a bandwidth requirement. So we were successful, as shown on the next slide, to design a pathway for transitioning teachers to digital learning with a particular formula that required 720 digital learning training hours per faculty, combining synchronous and asynchronous learning opportunities. And this covered a total of 169 faculty members, with 17 faculty champions and 15 faculty champions for experiential design. I'd like to articulate here that it's necessary for you to find the champions from among the faculty members, because that can impact on the quality of peer learning and support that will come from this experience. Meantime, we also had to transition the entire student body, as shown on the next slide, to a lot of other wellness-related initiatives done remotely. And we use the acronym NTC COPES to ensure that after accessing education, we now want them to be guaranteed some amount of success. So we had to provide them with remote challenges. Organizations, can you believe that? Student organizations were in operation despite the distance. Peers, whatever form of interaction virtually they can do, they had to engage there. Events and even concerts that students love best, we had to provide because that's part of their wellness. And of course, a lot of support channels had to be set in place. But the one thing that I'd love for you to understand is that behind this is our defined goal, which is to ensure that our students will continue to become contributory to the human capital development context of the Philippines despite the challenge. The current estimates now are shocking, because if we do not prepare them for the changing world of work because of the pandemic, they will largely suffer more. So on the next slide, you'll find out what we did was to build supportive industry clusters. We were working with our biggest industry partner, the Ministry of Education, because we were producing the majority of our students as would-be teachers, we had to connect with them and find out what they expect would be the changing behaviors and competencies of teachers. And then we had to reverse engineer the curriculum in such way that their pre-employability pathway is addressed immediately. And to date, it's the National Teachers College that was able to produce would-be teachers with advanced certifications that are just being given by the Ministry of Education to teachers in the field. So long before our students are able to graduate, the digital learning skills they need or digital teaching skills they need are already embedded in their consciousness. And that's why on the next screen, I'm very proud to tell you, the next slide rather, that we even enhanced our capability to actually increase the employment rate of our students from 43.66 to 90.61. And while many businesses are shutting down, we are quite surprised that the presence of our work-study programs, which also address the pain points in terms of monetary needs for access, was coupled by the preparation for them to really anticipate what's going to happen beyond their university life. And we would like to thank really and attribute this to an important component of our ecosystem, which I will show on the next slide. Recently, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development looked at specific pathways through which the skills strategies for a sustainable world of work will be delivered by various institutions. And fortunately, the workforce development program of the institution and our ecosystem of schools, as shown on the next slide, this is called the PEP, or the pre-employment program, was deemed as a very noteworthy example of how do we create a tightly integrated industry academe ecosystem as the pandemic is happening. So we were able to connect with industries to tell us what do you expect will change in the world of work because of the pandemic, and we will try to integrate that in the final year and semester of our students so they may be ready. And this accounts for the fact that we were quite successful in assigning them to our employment partners. I have limited time, so I'd like to wrap things up now. On the next slide, I'd like to tell you that given the direction globally to focus on ESG framework for ensuring sustainable development, this is how NTC will continue its narrative of engaging its various partners to ensure that there will really be an enabling access to success framework present. As shown on the next slide, the 3 dimensions of ESG are really in operation, but we would love to contribute more on the social dimension. And what we have already sealed as part of our institutional strategic direction beyond the pandemic are the following ways forward, as shown on my final slide. It is necessary for us to learn that we need to establish more structures for sustained conversations with learners, families, and school staff through insightful listening activities, because this will allow us to promote diversity and inclusion as our real institutional metrics of transformation and impact. And beyond this, it is important that we translate those needs, along with the requirement for a learning recovery plan, mindful of changing employability requirements. But to do this, there is that important need for us to balance both monetary and non-monetary instruments for inclusion and, more importantly now, wellness. I'd be happy to respond to some of your queries. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Reka and Edizon. Reka, thanks for a lot of the information. Your slides had a wealth of information in it in terms of data, statistics, and reports. And of course, participants, you know that the presentation materials will be made available, so you will find that extremely handy in Reka's presentation. And Edizon, thank you so much for I guess bringing up the points about the open gateways for continual studies. That was a really important part, I think, of the aspects that you shared with us. I like the education ecosystems, the flexibility, the agility needed going forward. That really ties into things that Oliver was saying and previous presenters, and the idea of champions at the staff level. So those are all really critical pieces, and thank you for sharing those. I'm going to encourage participants to use the chat space to send questions to both Reka and Edizon. In the interest of time, though, we are going to move on to our next presenter and encourage Edizon and Reka to continue the conversation to the chat space, including if you'd like to sort of expand a bit on the digital the digital transformation that happened during COVID and how that really impacted inclusion in higher education. So if you have a few additional points, you can please share those in the chat space. But on behalf of everybody, thank you so much for sharing all the experience and on the ground and at the high policy level as well. Thank you. Colleagues, in the interest of time, we are going to move now to our last presenter, and we're going to move all the way across the world here right now. We're going to move over to South America, everybody, and to end off the forum for today's session on quality education. And we are very excited to have Miss Alicia Quezada with us here from the Latin American region, and she is the Latin America Regional Director of the organization Practical Action, based in Peru. Early morning over in Peru. Thank you so much, Alicia, for being with us. Your work is oriented at the promotion of sustainable livelihoods for women and men with an inclusive approach. So this idea of inclusivity, very important. The improvement of schools in rural areas, resilience building, and green business and renewable energies, a good sort of cross-section of issues and background and experience. Before joining Practical Action, Alicia worked with the Ciudadanos al Día, promoting the best government practices in Peru. Certainly an interesting prize. I would have been in seeing the trends over the years, I'm sure. Alicia holds a degree in Communications for Development from the University of Lima and a Master's of Science in Development Management from the London School of Economics. Alicia, please take the floor and talk to us about pathways of change for education and resilience in Peru and Latin America.
Hello, everybody. I hope you see the presentation now.
Yes,
thank you for the opportunity to speak about the implementation of SDG for quality education in Peru. So the most complex challenges are found in rural and remote areas where children have basically lost 2 years of education due to the COVID pandemic and where schools are in bad condition. Around 30,000 of the schools in rural Peru lack water, electricity, and or internet access. So pathways of change we are working on and that we have selected to share with you today are the following. So the collaboration with the Ministry of Education for the development of a comprehensive strategy for rural and border areas. The COVID pandemic opened a political window of opportunity to put on the agenda the investment in rural communities as a priority, because children didn't have any internet access for interacting with their teachers. The strategy covers 5 enabling conditions and 4 components related to the life cycle in order to generate evidence supporting the strategy. We are working with pilot schools in the most difficult areas, both in the Amazon and the Andes, so that we test the strategy in the most challenging contexts. In these pilots, we are upgrading facilities with low-cost solutions to bring water, mainly through rain capture and wells, and energy through photovoltaic systems. Energy also enables the use of tablets and laptops for accessing educational resources. Communities are also building biogardens for environmental education and for reinforcing children's nutrition. Together with that, capacity building for children is focused on digital alphabetization, healthy habits, and soft skills. The training happens mainly through a long-term accompaniment strategy. And maybe the most important component, the local management committees. This is the core for ensuring sustainability of all improvements in schools. This is an important lesson from experience of working with the schools over the last 10 years. Communities made up of local leaders, parents, and authorities that represent the demand for improved education, so they ensure oversight and support the school's operation. Principally, the school family community triad is what needs to be strengthened towards sound learning processes and sustainability of investments. The second pathway is the development of applications in native languages for children in Andean and Amazon areas to be used on the tablets the governments have distributed. The COVID pandemic was an opportunity for the Ministry of Education to accelerate the production of these apps in collaboration with other organizations. For example, Practical Action supported the ministry to develop apps during 2020 and 2021 for Aymara, Awajún, and One Piece languages. Without the pandemic and private organizations, support these apps would have taken a lot longer to produce. There are around 225,000 children in indigenous communities in Peru. With the pandemic, producing good quality educational resources for them became a priority. And now they can access this content in their mother tongue for learning maths and communications, but also for learning Spanish as a second language. These apps have been well rated by children, second place only to Khan Academy app, according to the research unit of the ministry. Apps are regularly updated by local authorities as most rural areas don't have internet access. Also, a uCloudNet solution developed by Waiki company is beginning to be used as it allowed access to a huge global digital library. The third pathway is working on civil society coalitions to provide continuity in educational reforms. In a context of high and continuous political instability exacerbated by the pandemic, these coalitions have ensured the continuity of dialogue, reflection, and research. That they have also pushed hard for the main reforms process to continue in Peru, such as the reform of ensure education with a gender approach and the regulation to increase the quality of university education. These coalitions, made up of independent experts, researchers, active organizations, and the private sector, also complement leverage funds and support government initiatives at local and national levels. Good examples of these coalitions in Peru include the Committee of Leaders of Education of IPAE Business Association, the Companies for Education Association, the Coalition for Education Peruvian chapter organized by UNICEF and UNESCO, the Good Government Practices Prize promoted by Ciudadanos al Día, an organization that showcases the best practices of public entities at different levels, the Sustainable Peru platform that recognizes diverse initiatives toward the SDGs. The Ministry of Education itself also opened a space called Allies for Education to better collaborate with civil society and private entities. So we need to navigate in uncertain waters and highly unstable contexts. So these coalitions provide in some sense stable ground to keep development processes going. Here there's a short video to illustrate briefly these pathways of change.
En esta charla de Futuro Brillante que tuvimos nos dijeron, bueno, de que íbamos a tener una sala de innovación, los servicios básicos, la tecnología como el TIC, ¿no? Puede ser la tableta, los laptops, eso y el biohuerto que poco a poco se lo vio que se hizo realidad.
Va a haber el agua, la energía que va todo el día. Los niños van a estar adecuados para hacer su enseñanza, para captar más información.
Vacunus dieno, vacunus papinas ojuno, vacunus papinas profesor trabajo cumates en lleno, llame tablet tante así hasta castar pregunta así hectárea no tan así agutata pesa vacunus dieno.
El proyecto del biohuerto yo creo que es muy importante esto porque muchos niños inclusive se interesan porque saben que también van a recibir de allí, pero también están estimulados realmente mirando sus productos que ellos hacen.
Como docente yo quisiera que ellos sean pues los jóvenes profesionales que la comunidad necesita de ellos, que ellos con este proyecto despierten en pensar más allá, ser grandes profesionales, un médico, un profesor.
En realidad lo que queremos es lograr la comprensión lectora tanto en lengua materna y también en castellano.
Por eso el niño tiene que saber leer, escribir y hablar en su lengua materna. Nosotros necesitamos esa riqueza, no podemos perder.
Yacha atasa wakirahe. Teknologia takasta sa wakirahe. Unimar to sa wakirahe. Internet ang takasta sa wakirahe. Pati ang mau kasir penggereje.
So before moving on, let's keep that in mind. These powers of change are possible with firm commitments and formal agreements with the ministry and the local education authorities. And of course, the core of it all with a close dialogue and a strengthening of the school, family, community triad. Now, looking at the reality of that triad, the pursuit of a quality education goes hand in hand with the pursuit of gender equality and resilience, building in a context of climate change and in a post-pandemic world. Climate change and the pandemic have exacerbated gender disparities, affecting girls' education and women's work burden. On average, women in Latin America cities spend twice as much as time on domestic tasks. This happens regardless of the fact that they share the responsibility of generating income, which means they have a double day. In addition to working outside home, they also take care of tasks within it. In the last 2 years, the majority of women have taken up homeschooling. In rural spaces, the expectations of women's dedication to the home is even greater. Practical action will work hand in hand with vulnerable communities, and we can observe this every day. The pressure on women is even greater than it was before. They are still responsible for food, care, and education, but now the conditions for achieving them are even tougher. In this context of multiple crises in the region, but also in many parts of the world, we need to promote women and men working as a team in household tasks and assuming responsibilities in an equitable way. We have seen that families who in a shared way assume the responsibilities of food, care, and education have much better possibilities to adapt and face the crisis that external factors bring. The will of man in this context of multiple crises is pivotal towards more resilient and happy families. Wherever we work with companies, government, or civil society organizations, let's take this message to our collaborators and partners. It's not an easy transformation to make because it involves reducing the burden that women carry and redistributing it, but it's a necessary change, and it is the men who need to make the most important shift. Working with the gender approach for building resilience is very powerful. In Bolivia, in the High Andes, we have trained men and women to promote teamwork within families to progressively change the inequality mindset. During lockdown, local promoters that coordinated with local authorities and organized farmers to be able to diversify farming production with a resilient approach, commercialize their products, and ensure food security. Also, a network of young leaders was created around the Madiri Pampas Natural Reserve and this Amazon region for capacity building on environmental protection and local economic development through tourism. From the design of the initiative, we pushed for equitable gender participation, and training was focused on leadership, empowerment, and the fight against gender violence. Via the platform, we promoted personal growth, knowledge, and useful tools for the preservation of the environment, as well as confidence and trust amongst participants. So it became a safe space to share between friends and promote a different mindset in young people towards equity between men and women. They are now active in promoting education and job opportunities with public and private actors working in sustainable tourism. Due to the pandemic and associated crisis, many of them arrived in this space with many ecological problems. Though we had to join efforts with other organizations and local government offices working in human rights and skilled in emotional and legal support. In Peru and Bolivia, we are strengthening the social capital and building resilience through early warning systems focused on floods and landslides in its four components: knowledge of risks, monitoring risks and setting alarms, communication to the wide community, and response. We have strengthened women leadership and promoted complementary roles in the different stages. In relation to technology and community involvement, which are usually the main barriers, we have designed community-based and low-cost climatic stations with open source software, and we are also promoting citizen science to complement scientific research. This technology has been tested and accepted by the scientific government entities and could be replicated in diverse areas and risks. Finally, we are taking these approaches on building resilience across the Latin American region in collaboration with you and environment by generating knowledge, sharing spaces for public officials and environment ministries, building climate adaptation plans in diverse geographies and climates in the Caribbean islands, intermediate cities, coastal areas, deserts, and the Amazon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alicia. You touched on so many interesting aspects. I mean, I really appreciate the land-based education examples. Were extremely interesting, and you brought up aspects of the need for thinking outside the box, the students thinking outside the box. That ties back into, I know, things that Oliver had mentioned earlier. Thank you for touching on aspects of resilience, social capital, citizen science. I mean, bringing all these pieces together, extremely important and really interesting the way you kind of encompassed it all in the initiatives that you outlined. Interesting also is that you talked about partnerships and coalitions and how important that was for dealing through instability. And I'm wondering if you might be able to expand a bit on in terms of how did you sort of create a strategy around the rural and border areas, and do that within a context of political instability? How does that sort of tie into the partnerships and coalitions aspect as well?
Yes, definitely. For you to have an idea, in a couple of years that we have been collaborating with the Ministry of Education, 7 different ministers have been in office. So how could we manage this level of instability? Well, as I mentioned, working in coalitions actually helps to have sufficient leverage, but also working with middle management, public officials that were permanent in their roles. So these strategies are crucial to continue process through frequent changes of ministries and directors. Now, we need to strengthen the public career, and that is, I think we are conscious that that is very important for all SDGs, you know? So to have committed and well-prepared professionals in those middle management positions. Now, that strategy has been developed very slowly, but now we are in the process of validating it, and we really hope it will be approved soon. But important is that the idea of the strategy and the elements, enabling conditions, etc., was designed in a lot of collaboration between the public officials in the Ministry of Education and taking also the views of the different coalitions from civil society and experience of different organizations in the ground in very remote areas, because it's a strategy to serve them and to try to reach those populations that were postergated.
Oh, excellent. That's thanks so much. That's really the power of partnerships and why it's a cross-cutting goal across all these conversations in this forum here this week. Thank you. Muchas gracias. Excellent. And thank you also for providing the video too, and seeing the pictures of the kids at work. It was really quite fantastic. We are going to, in the interest of time, we are going to move right to the closing, a bit of the closing session here. And so Jean will take the floor. Alicia, thank you so much on behalf of all the participants, and please do keep an eye on the chat space, Alicia, for questions that pop up. I do want to remind participants that we do have the discussion page, and I do see that there's been some wonderful examples being posted to the poster board and discussion page. And we encourage you to continue to do so even after the forum here ends shortly. And throughout the week, each day we'll present a new page for a different topic, but all the pages are open to contribute to. So we do encourage you to continue your efforts to participate in that poster space. So with that, lots of good information, John, across all the presentations. Extremely interesting, touched on a lot of really common themes. Over to you, Jean, just to kind of close us out and let participants know what we're headed for here in the second session of the forum coming up tomorrow.
I'll do the at the same time. I'll do, if you don't mind, the official closing. So basically, it's very surprising as time went very, very fast tonight, and this is already the end of this first session. It was indeed very condensed and impressive. At the same time, of course, it's different from when we are all together, because we would take a break, a coffee, would like to continue conversation with one person or another. It's interesting to see how we succeeded to do somehow with the chat box and the Slido or the other instruments we're trying to add to have a more direct interaction. But of course, anyway, it went very, very fast, and well, there was a lot of very interesting information. I'm not sure I got, I have to listen back to the sessions, and then that brings me also to the fact that I should also mention to everyone that those sessions are recorded, video recorded, and then we'll have access to it. But basically, this session on goal 4 on quality education, in this perspective of advancing the 2030 agenda through education, vocational training, and capacity building. And we talked about also building back better or building forward better. Now, a lot of people are talking about this from the pandemic, fostering the implementation of 2030 agenda again. A lot of presentations, many presentations had the how do you say, issues that were in one and in other. I think inclusiveness was a very important issue. Even in the poll mentioned, that was interesting, the poll mentioned that it was very important, and it's often not the reality for many people, policymakers. Access is also, was surprising to see access, and particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. And also we discussed about different groups, social groups, and different people with disability. We touched upon that a little bit. I think I wish we could have bring a little more in this as well, but that was quite interesting. Access, yeah, in sub-Saharan Africa, we're really affected by COVID-19. I was surprised to see that IT, information technology, was not necessarily used so much for education purpose. I see that the digitalization is also both seen as very great potential solution, but also it's a tool with double-edged, also a double-edged sword. We heard about the fake news, which we know a lot, violence, harassment, control, and also the fact that we depend more and more on this maybe big, huge companies, conglomerates for our learning, both, in many aspects, as a source, but also as a reservoir, or where to collect this information and share this information or this learning, and even shape our learning. That was an important issue. Monitoring was very important, and yet again, data is also important issue in terms of collection and sharing. And the last presentation also, education in terms of capacity building to improve people's daily lives, their resilience. I see also promote gender equality, which also connects us to tomorrow's topic, basically. But before talking about tomorrow, I just want to again thank all the distinguished opening speakers, Mr. Zhenmin, UN Undersecretary General for Economic Social Affairs, Her Excellency Han Young A, Minister of Environment, Republic of Korea, Mr. Chung Park, Head of Office UNOSD, and His Excellency Ambassador Morikawa Toru, Executive Director, SF. I'd like to also thank all the speakers for their very informative presentation and discussion. Mr. Marino Antoninis, Mr. Louis Meuleman, Mr. Oliver Liang, and Ms. Reka Tozsa, Mr. Edizon Fermin, and Ms. Alicia Quezada. Well, we have your bios on our website also, but thank you. There's not much time, and then I don't want to take too much. I want to remind actually that your bios are there, and there all the materials again we used. People shared, include the speech, presentations, video recording, but also reference material will be uploaded and available on our the website of the Sustainable Transformation Forum. It's easy. Otherwise, you find it through unosd.un.org. You will find our SDTF web page there. I'd like to remind the speakers to please share links to reference, additional reference. You can send, and then we'll add to the page again. And I'd like to thank you all for the participants also who joined us for this first session of the Sustainable Development Transformation Forum. Again, please join us tomorrow for another important session, which will be dedicated to Goal 5 on gender equality. We'll explore the concept and reality of building back or forward better for the COVID-19 pandemic through a gender perspective. Of course, we have 2 more so 3 to go, Wednesday, 2nd, and Thursday, 3rd of March for the 3rd and 4th session of the Sustainable Development Transformation Forum. I'd like to convey a special thanks to our partner, the Asia Europe Foundation. I'd like to thank Mr. Darren Swenson for excellent work in monitoring this session, and also as well as all the UNOSD staff and interns who worked very hard behind the scenes to make this session run very smoothly. And finally, I'd like to all thank you. Have a good day, evening, evening, depending on where you are. And please come back tomorrow for the next session on gender equality. Thank you.